Good evening and welcome to our fifth and final presentation of the year. I'm Brent Taylor, convener of the speaker program for Military History and Heritage Victoria. On behalf of our committee, I welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. Tonight, we're pleased to have Michael Veitch presenting Borneo, the Last Campaign. Now, a little about Michael. Michael is a well-known author, actor, and former ABC television and radio presenter. His books include the critically acclaimed accounts of Australian airmen in World War II, 44 Days, Heroes of the Sky, Fly, Flak, Barney Great Treks, Turning Point, and the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, and Australia's Secret Army, the story of coast watchers in World War II. He lives in the Yarra Valley outside Melbourne. A little bit of process before Michael begins. He'll be talking for about 40 minutes. He'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation. We can do this in two ways. If you're feeling shy, post a chat message anytime up to and including question time, and address the question to everybody. When the time comes, I'll read your question using your first name, or at least the name on your computer. Or you can wait and put your hand up during question time, and I'll invite you to ask your question verbally. Michael's happy to have your screens on, but remember that everyone can also see you. But please make sure your microphones are switched off. By now, you should be on speaker view of some sort, and I invite Michael to speak.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Jason, for organising this. It's lovely to speak to you again. It's been a couple of years, I think. And it's always quite intimidating having an audience who probably know more about the subject than I do. So I just have to take that on board and apologise for any missteps or egregious errors, and you're very welcome to point them out. But this book, the story of Borneo, it is probably going to be my last book on Australians in the Pacific. And it's been quite a long journey. And it's been a chronological journey largely. My first book on Australian Pacific was the air war, the air defence, I should say, of Port Moresby in early 1942, when, a real David and Goliath struggle of a very newly formed group of young airmen and a couple of time-expired veterans held off the Japanese air armada, softening up Moresby. This is in the months before the Kokoda campaign got underway. I then wrote a book about the Battle of Milne Bay, an extraordinary battle, the first time Japan was defeated on land anywhere in the war, and it was done by us. My next one was on the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, which is always because my interest was primarily the air war, not so much now, but then primarily the air war. This extraordinary episode, one of the shortest, and I wonder, the Bismarck Sea battle was, for its longevity, which was 20 minutes, probably the most decisive battle, one of the most decisive battles in history, for its length, if you know what I mean. If that convoy had been allowed to disgorge its supplies to the Japanese army in New Guinea, they reckon the war in New Guinea could have been extended another year or so. Then the general story of the coast watchers who operated all throughout the war, but particularly at the beginning, is an astonishing story. But these are all stories that really concern the beginning of the Pacific War, and very little has been written about the end of it, particularly the end of it, which was the Borneo campaign. It's extraordinary to think that Australia was the last man standing in World War II. Everybody else had packed up and gone home. The United States had more or less wrapped up its Big Island campaign, conducted all those dreadful battles around the Japanese mainland, Iwo Jima and all those ones. MacArthur further south had more or less declared victory in the Philippines. The British had wrapped up their reconquest of Burma by the last few months of World War II. But Australia, with American help, was sent to what was essentially a sideshow of the liberation from Japanese occupation of the island of Borneo, a huge chunk of the Netherlands East Indies, which the Japanese had occupied very early on in their campaign of Thanks, Jason. That's great. Just hold that one for a moment. Which the Japanese had conquered very early on in the Pacific War. In fact, I think the first attacks on Borneo were actually in 1941, before even just a couple of weeks after Pearl Harbor, as they did, attacking Malaya and so forth, as we know. And their objective, of course, was oil. Oil became a huge factor not only in the Japanese invasion of Borneo, but in the Allied reconquest of Borneo, although it was a strangely asymmetrical necessity, oil, by this stage, which we'll get to later. Um, it's a strange fact that the Australian Army basically did very little for almost an entire year. After we'd mopped up the northern coast of New Guinea, those actions at Saddleberg and Shaggy Ridge, the amphibious invasion of Lae, which was an incredibly important precursor to the invasion of Borneo, this one. We were then sort of doing nothing. The 1st Australian Army Corps, just about all 80,000 men, spent from more or less sort of late 1944, early 1944, mid 1944 to mid 1945, training in the Atherton tablelands for a job they did not know was coming. And it became a very strange political story, because some people in Parliament were saying, well, why not send these blokes home? We have a manpower shortage back here, but General MacArthur, and they said, well, or else we should get General MacArthur to actually use them. Now, MacArthur was a funny bloke. As you know, he was in charge of the Australian Armed Forces and all through the war, in the Pacific at least. And it's pretty obvious that pretty early on that he didn't really want to share the glory in the reconquest of Japan with anyone, particularly Britain, and of course, including Australia. Even though he was reliant on Australia, particularly geographically and supply-wise, the first couple of years while the Americans got going. Once they had got going, we didn't become a nuisance, but we became an adjunct to his plans that didn't really include us. So he had this strange scenario, sort of from late 1944 onwards, where you had people like Blamey, and various politicians hassling MacArthur and Americans, saying, well, what are you going to do with this? What can we do? You promised us we were going to be part of the Great Philippines campaign. And it's true. MacArthur earlier had said, I will go to the Philippines and the 1st Australian Army Corps will be by my side all the way. And the Philippines campaign got going in June 1944, and Australia didn't get the nod, and like, oh, where are we? Well, what's actually happening? And then he fudged it, and General Sutherland, one of MacArthur's very difficult administrative generals, was sort of fudging and saying, well, we'll use you Aussies in something. We just don't know what yet. It's going to be a long campaign, the Philippines. We'll bring you in at some stage, but we don't know when. And so that was the sort of situation as in the final months of 1944, and we kind of were feeling rather miffed with it. Australia felt that we deserved a seat at the table in the peace conference. I mean, it's kind of weird because there was no seat and there was no table after the war, but we thought we deserved a seat at the table to decide the future course of the Pacific post-war. Well, we made a bit of a fuss. There's a wonderful story of Tom Blamey actually flying unannounced to basically present himself to MacArthur's forward headquarters somewhere off in the Pacific long after he'd left Australia. And MacArthur, even though he was General, MacArthur detested personal confrontation. He was really bad at it. He just got very shy and awkward and would just wanted it to be over. And Blamey was a very kind of he could be quite belligerent and forceful, and they didn't want to leave on a bad note. And MacArthur said, "Look, all right, look, I'll arrange for you to do something. Look, what about Borneo?" And I said, "What do you mean Borneo?" "Well, Borneo is a big part of the Japanese Empire, and we're going the other direction. It's near Australia. Why don't you guys do it? It needs to be liberated. It's full of oil. We need the oil. So why don't we assist you with our the maritime element, warships and transport ships, of which Australia had virtually none, and we'll send you there, and you Aussies can kick the Japs out of Borneo. You can liberate the oil fields of Balikpapan and Tarakan and the ones in North Borneo, and we can use the airstrips as well for the further pushing the Japanese out of the Netherlands East Indies, going off in that westerly direction." You see, people forget, looking back on this period, I just have to pause here. Nobody expected the war to end when it did. I know it sounds like a kind of an obvious thing now, but plans were going forward for the war to keep going well into 1946. So we envisaged a long campaign pushing the Japanese back from Borneo from their bases in the Celebes and that map there, then into Java and places like that. So people thought it was going to go on for a long time. Australia would have the glory of finishing off the Japs in this part of the world, and the Americans would, probably would be the ones actually landing on the Japanese mainland. That was how basically people saw the war in the Pacific ending. Well, of course, the atomic bombs got in the way, and suddenly it was all over. And we'd only begun the first part of this big campaign that was more or less exclusively Australian. So it was planned. There were initially 6 invasions of Borneo planned. They were given the code name OBOE, and it was going to be OBOEs 1 to 6. Eventually, only 3 were decided upon because the other 3, one was complete madness. It was OBOE 4 was going to be sending a division straight up the mouth of the Japanese in Java. It would have been a bloodbath. The other was a invasion of that little other town you can see down on the bottom of the map there, Banjarmass, and another oil port there. And the other one was, I can't remember what the other one was, but they didn't. So that they decided on OBOEs 1, 2, and 6. So people studying the Borneo campaign, it's kind of weird. It goes in order. It went OBOE 1, OBOE 6, and OBOE 2 because the other ones were dropped and the time frame was changed. The first, it involved the 7th and the 9th divisions. As I said, they'd been training for a long time on the Atherton tablelands. The first Australian Army Corps at this stage was a strange mixture of very experienced and often exhausted blokes that had been in the war for years. Some had been right through Tobruk, Alamein, both Alameins. Then came Greece. Some got back from Greece, the debacle in Greece. Thank you, Mr. Churchill. Then they were some had been at Kokoda and all those areas, Milne Bay. Some of them they'd been all the way through, and some had been cleaning up the Japanese in on the north coast of New Guinea. So it was either those blokes, and a lot of them were being retired out of the army. They'd done their bit. Some didn't want to go. Some were desperate to go. And a whole bunch of new guys, kids, who had just done some training, and they knew the war was coming to an end, and they were desperate to get into the war in some way. So it was a strange camp, the Australian Army, during this last year. The unit sort of hegemony had broken down a bit because it didn't feel like it had for the last few years. But there you go. They were sent into, they were gradually in stages sent to the island of Morotai, where they were to group and do a little bit more amphibious training. And they were sent to the first of the OBOE invasions, OBOE 1, which was Tarakan Island in June 1945. OBOE although 6 was to be British. Just go back to that previous one for a sec, Joseph, could you? Thanks. Oboe 6 was up here on the left there, the invasion of Sarawak, which was part of British North Borneo. Um, it was a two-pronged thing. That other arrow is a bit deceptive there. And the last one, which took place in May, June, and July 1945. Sorry, May, June, July 1945. The 1st of July 1945 was Balikpapan, which was a huge oil facility, as you can see on the at about sort of 4 o'clock, if you imagine the island of Borneo to be a clock face. So moving on to the next slide, Jason, thank you. The first one was Tarakan, a tiny little island off the north eastern coast of Borneo itself, dripping with oil. It was a very large maritime amphibious invasion, which took place on the 1st of May, I think, 1945, involving thousands of Australian troops that basically invaded the beach at that place you can see, Lingus, the actual town of Tarakan. Tarakan's tiny, and the objective was severalfold to secure that airfield there, to take the oil facilities where those little dots are. Parmusian, it's called there. That's all those little dots are basically oil wells and oil tanks and all that sort of thing. And to, of course, suppress any Japanese resistance on the island. To what the Australians expected of the Japanese is quite interesting. It was all a bit vague because we didn't really know. But the troops in Borneo were assured that that resistance would be feeble. And it went along, the narrative went something like this. It said, look, we know you guys have been fighting the Japanese for 4 years. Where we know that they're brutal. We know that they won't surrender, but they are so broken now. They're so desperate. They're so starving. These are just ragtag, composite units, some non-combatants, very little fighting spirit left in them. It will be, and I quote, this campaign will be more like a complex exercise than a military campaign per se. That's what the men were led to believe, and this is what this, I think, is going into Tarakan. Yes, as you can see, a massive amount of American hardware in terms of landing craft, a couple of Australian ships that have been converted into landing ship, either LSIs, former ocean liners with thousands of troops, the Westralia and the other one I've forgotten, but they disgorged men into landing craft infantry such as this, or this could be a landing craft infantry, I think this one is. But it was about a week's sailing from Morotai, and this is what the Australians encountered as they hit the beaches which had been prepared by the sappers. We'll get to them in a moment. A massive convoy. Especially the young soldiers couldn't believe what they were looking at. They knew that the scale of modern war was spectacular, but they couldn't believe it. These photos just don't do justice to what it must have been like. Hundreds of ships all around. They say that you couldn't see the beginning of it and you couldn't see the end of it. We had no idea where we were in the actual convoy. It could have just gone on forever like space. And then when they actually started to hit, I love this photo. I had to put this in. These are the sappers. Now, the Japanese had, of course, mined all the beaches of Borneo because they knew we were coming extensively. Hundreds and hundreds of sea mines and other sorts of mines rammed onto posts, shoved almost horizontally into the sand. These guys had to go in before the main invasion, dismantle all of them, cut big swathes of 80 to 100 meters wide in the beach obstacles so the landing craft could get in the correct order. They were covered in oil, as you can see. They had to go in at low tide in daylight, in full view of the enemy. They were so brave. They were so brilliant. And they got such little recognition. That guy on the top left, that rope around him, because they were at low tide, and thanks, mate. That's where Jason put the arrow. Because they were at low tide, and there wasn't much water. If they got into trouble, they wouldn't be able to get back out to sea. So a couple of them tied ropes to their waists, which went all the way to a landing craft that just had a bit of water under it. And if they got into trouble, they just pull these guys out by a rope. Meanwhile, and they actually did it. The projected casualties, secretly, the projected casualties of the sappers in this operation was going to be about 30%. That's what they had planned for. In the end, there were no casualties. It's quite remarkable, except a couple of accidents, because as we'll discover, the Japanese, of course, knew this was coming, knew they couldn't repel the invasion, and went inland. And that's where the real campaign of Borneo starts. This is one of the beaches. I think this might be Balikpapan, but this is what it looked like for hours and hours, often days on end. Aerial bombardments by RAAF, liberators who actually didn't do a very good job. They smashed up the very thing that we were supposed to be there, invading the oil facilities. We'll get to those in a moment. But the soldiers going ashore on the American landing crafts in the correct order were treated to this incredible fireworks display of the beaches basically erupting in front of them, trees spilled into the air, whole buildings being lifted up like toys and thrown down again. It was quite spectacular. The various beaches that they hit, they found to be relatively undefended. Not entirely undefended. The Japanese always left, this is Labuan, the North Borneo beach. It's all smashed to pieces. And even though they'd studied really hard on very well-designed maps of where they were going to land, nothing was recognizable because it was all smashed to pieces by the time they got there. Having said no casualties, this is a casualty, an Australian being taken away in a stretcher there. The AWN doesn't give me any more information. The Australians got to the beaches with the help of the American ducks and the alligator landing craft. Amazing. Oh, good. There are some ducks, number 105 there. And behind them, Jace, can you just point the arrow to those alligators just behind there? They're an amazing craft, built for the swamplands of America. They were used extensively in the latter part of the war. They were brilliant. They had these cleated tracks that pushed themselves along in the water much more efficiently than a duck, which wasn't very stable in the water. And you could fit 30 blokes into these. And there were a couple of machine gunners on the top. And the Americans did a wonderful job in bringing our fellows to these shores. Now, when the Australians got there, we'll deal with Tarakan first. But really, in all three operations, it's sort of a similar story over the 3 months that Borneo evolved. In May, when they went into Tarakan, they found the beach relatively undefended. They started pushing inland, and that's when the real fight began. The same with North Borneo. They went first to the island of Labuan, which was a island sort of that guards the big entrance to the harbour, a big natural harbour, which is North Borneo. But the Japanese had, as they did all everywhere, dug themselves into the interior of the island in no uncertain terms. I have to sip my tea, hang on. The Australians were told that there would be fighting inland, but as in all battles, nobody really knew how it would evolve. What it did evolve to was a strangely schizoid series of concentrations where the Australian forces pushed inland into this increasingly deteriorating terrain, which became hilly, jungly, unbearably humid, far worse than even New Guinea. All the soldiers said this was the worst place we went to because there are so many little valleys and ravines and escarpments, absolutely perfect defensive territory. So even though the Japanese didn't have a lot of numbers, they used their numbers very well. And any notion that the Japanese were finally willing to face reality and consider surrendering were completely erased in the first few days of the war. As always, the Japanese soldier of the Second World War, by and large, was prepared to die 100 times over, living on a handful of rice a day, and take a few enemy soldiers with him to the grave, even though they knew they were facing certain annihilation and their cause was hopeless and had been hopeless for years. It's impossible for us to get our head around about what these people were thinking, let alone the savagery and the cruelty, and I can only use the word sadism that the Japanese used against not just Australia, but everyone. The other element of the invasion of Borneo was, of course, to liberate the civilians, which we'll get to in a moment. The civilians had had a terrible time wherever the Japanese occupied the Pacific in World War II, Borneo being absolutely no exception. They were starving by the end of it. They'd been enslaved, abused, their women raped, women taken for sexual slaves. Absolutely diabolical stuff. So beyond, um, the kind of fighting rules and fighting laws that even the Germans had, and the Australians. We grew up in a liberal democracy, if you like, even back then. One former Australian soldier once told me fighting the Japanese was like we thought we were fighting Martians, because and he'd been in Tobruk and he admired the Germans tremendously. I mean, he fought them and killed them, but he admired them, and they would play fair. But the Japanese, you could not get a bearing on where they were coming from or where they were thinking. So you basically had to kill them. And that's what it was like. The Pacific was a brutal, brutal struggle fought at the end of the world supply lines, at the edge of the world, in a very, very difficult terrain from start to finish. But I'm sort of wandering off in the weeds. Back to Tarakan. Um, this is some sappers building up the interior with that plank. I thought repairing a bridge. Bridges had to be repaired. Japanese had blown piers and bridges, which prevented supplies being offloaded. And there's great stories of those same sappers that had got rid of the mines, then being told to repair some of the wharfs and the piers, and often under sniper fire. The Japanese main defense against Australians was booby traps, snipers, and very well embedded machine gun nests, and operating at night time. Very few Japanese attacks, and there were Japanese attacks incurred during the day because they were outnumbered, but the Japanese became adept at attacking the Australians at night. The course of the battle really went along the lines of the various battalions, and there would have, I think there were about 16 entire battalions who took part in the various Borneo operations. And all of them had the same experience, pushing uphill during the day, bringing in their Matilda tanks, which were used to great effect by the Australian armoured regiments. We even had and here's one here. I love this shot. I love the war correspondent in the front there, getting his shots for Cine Sound or Movie Tone to be flown back that day in a Liberator. Well, actually, no, they couldn't land, but shipped back to Morotai for that first bit. Here's a Matilda pushing its way from a landing craft tank to start doing its work. We even had a thing called the Frog, which was an Australian developed, I think they developed it at Puckapunnu or Holsworthy or somewhere, a flame-throwing tank. Unlike the British Churchill tank, which carried its fuel behind it in a kind of a little wagon, the armored engineers in Australia developed a way to have the fuel on board the Matilda and for it to spurt out 80 meters. And they found that was the only thing that could wheedle the Japanese out of their positions. But of course, the tanks couldn't often get up there because these roads were very narrow and long and windy. And as the weeks bore on, the campaign became more and more enervating and exhausting. Astonishing acts of bravery from the word go. We'll get to the VC winners later, but so many acts of common heroism, and so many displayed by the average private soldier. A lot of MCs were awarded to the officers. but so many more military medals. Blokes that, if they were officers, they would have got DSOs or DSCs for sure. But because they were lowly privates, oh, the military medal will do. But my God, so many stories of people just throwing themselves in front of machine guns to rescue a bloke, astonishing acts of bravery. This is the sort of thing that they found that they were up against. Jason, so sorry, mate, just go back to that previous one. Okay, this is a Japanese depth charge that, as you can see, has been dug into the ground because the Japanese didn't have any ships anymore. But the ordnance from their campaign of their aerial bombs, from the aerial and sea campaigns, aerial bombs and landmines and depth charges were used to great effect in this campaign. They slowed the Australians down tremendously on all these winding tracks that went up into the hills. Hundreds and hundreds of very well primed booby traps. The Japanese have been working on this for months. They've been reinforcing the place for years, but working on making it as difficult for the Australians or the Allies, whoever was going to turn up to conquer the place, as they could. Now, as you guys probably know, that a depth charge goes off, it can take out a city block. The TNT packed into these things is enormous. And the sappers and the engineers had desperate times unhooking and dismantling hundreds of these things, often under fire by the Japanese. They put them in places where the Japanese had enfilading sniper fire and they could see through binoculars. So a lot of engineers were killed doing it. They would do clever sort of, clever, nasty, clever things, like they would leave a section of telegraph wire intact, but cut it over just at one place next to a telegraph pole where they knew that a truck could back up to the telegraph pole and a bloke could stand on the roof of the truck or the tank and fix it like that. But what they'd done is placed a couple of mines just a tire lengths away from the telegraph pole so the tires would detonate the mine. I mean, evil, clever thinking, but kind of brilliant in a kind of way. Just go that next slide, Jason. So this is sort of stuff that they encountered that they did not know they were going to encounter. Heavily reinforced concrete pillboxes, dozens of them, manned by Japanese machine gunners and riflemen. More rifle fire. The Japanese didn't have many machine guns in this campaign. We don't know why, but very accurate rifle fire. They had a few of their woodpecker machine guns, which were deadly, very, very powerful gun, and they caused a lot of damage. And they hadn't been told that this is what they were going to be expecting. They're told there'll be some dugouts and some headquarters and things, but they didn't expect anything like this. The campaign, one of the great objectives of the Tarakan campaign was, of course, the airstrip. Now, the airstrip was considered of vital importance to be captured in the first few days. If you can see one of the airstrip shots, Jason, go to that. We'll come back to this one. If you can, it was considered vital that the airstrips be taken, and quickly, because the Tarakan airstrip was going to be used for further aspects of the campaign going on towards the East Indies, towards the Netherlands East Indies. But what they found when they got there, as you can see, the Tarakan airstrip was completely routed, to use my French. This is all Australian bombs, by the way. The Royal Australian Air Force was told to soften up the place, but to avoid the airstrip. But this is what they'd look like when the engineers got there to prepare it for Spitfires and Kitty Hawks and Mitchells and Bostons and Liberators to come in and use it. Well, as you can see, completely impossible. Not only did these bombs create holes, but that white stuff you can see is basically the part of the crushed coral understory of the airstrip that kept the water out, because it was virtually at sea level. So this is what happened when the tides came in after they'd smashed it up like this. It became a bog, and they didn't know what to do. At high tide, it was literally under a half a foot of water. So they had to spend weeks and weeks draining it and repairing the holes. They employed a lot of local labor, or these local people more than happy to come out and help the Allies. But it was the RAAF did not cover themselves in glory. And this is just one of the things that they did not cover themselves in glory. The Air Force in bombing not just this airstrip, but the one on Balikpapan as well. And not just the airstrips, but completely destroying virtually all the oil infrastructure, which was the other main objective of the Borneo campaign. This is the refinery, I think, in the north of Tarakan. And as you can see, it's completely useless, completely smashed. Their oil storage bins, or what do you call them, tanks, which of course had burnt for days before, melting the metal like sort of deflated balloons. So the Australians got in there and said, "What the hell have we been fighting here for? We can't capture this. It's completely stuffed." The whole question of oil is interesting as well, and this what is one of the controversies of Balikpapan. MacArthur had said, "We'll just stay on the oil for a little while. If you can find that one over the tank coming up through Balikpapan, Jason, that'd be great. But don't bust a gut doing it." MacArthur had said, we need the oil, we need the oil. And to prove that he needed the oil to the Chief of Staff in Washington, he commissioned a high-ranking, well, he was a civilian, but to become a high-ranking civilian, a civilian general, if you like, because he'd been a senior oil executive in America during the war. And he did a survey of what possibly the Borneo oil could contribute to America's overall oil supply. And to MacArthur's horror, he said, well, basically, it's not going to contribute much at all. We've got oil enough in reserves in America to keep us going into about August 1946 at this rate. So MacArthur, as we know, was a kind of a fiddly diddler in many ways. He just basically wanted to get the Australians out of the way. That's one of the readings of the whole Borneo campaign. However, we did the job extremely well. Getting back to the battle itself, we'll come back to a bit of the politics a little bit later. How am I going for time? Yeah, all right. This is what the progress through the Borneo invasions was. Small tracks, middle of jungle, hiding behind a Matilda tank as it clears, as engineers try and clear mines in front of it, and Japanese bullets are going ping, ping, ping off the armor in front of that Matilda tank. The guy's got his hatch open, as you can see. He does not have his head sticking out of that hatch, or it could easily get blown off. They went into battle often with hull down. The Matilda, the armored regiment drivers. Imagine how hot it would have been. Stressing again, the conditions were really dreadful. Very, very humid, very foggy and muggy, and really just awful. One of the only advantages of particularly Tarakan is that the whole place was so redolent with oil. Blokes would walk through swamps and their boots would be black because oil basically seeped out of the ground. There were no mosquitoes because the oil kept the mosquitoes at bay, so there wasn't any malaria or dengue fever, which was very, very handy. The second, okay, I'm jumping ahead to the third part of the Borneo invasion, which was Balikpapan Obo II. Les Cook, that's him there. He's still alive. He's 102. I met him at his home in Canberra, and he told me about an entire battle that the Australians were involved with that I had never heard of. It gets about 2 paragraphs in the official history, and in his battalion history, which I think was the 2nd 14th, it gets a couple of pages. But Veitch was, again, pushing towards one of the airstrips on Balikpapan, finding it was in slightly better condition, this one, but the Japanese had secured positions in the hills a couple of miles from the airstrip and overlooking it, and they were bringing shell fire onto the airstrip, and they had mounted field guns in tunnels covered by metal embrasures. The only way was to get rid of them was to climb up these hills, and get rid of them or virtually by hand. And that's what this 3-day battle was. They called it Waite's Knoll because some bloke called Waits got killed trying to throw a packet of a haversack full of pickrite explosive into an embrasure to knock out a Japanese gun. He got shot dead for his trouble. It then became this standoff in this monsoonal rain that poured down. Les, just go back to it for a sec, Jason. Les, this is actually about 100 meters up on the top of a ridge. You can see Les's Bren gun there, the magazine and the barrel there. Les hadn't had any sleep for about 2 days, and what he's doing up there, he's watching the other ridge and calling down what he can see to the commanding officer, lieutenant at the bottom of this sort of escarpment, saying, "What's happening, Les? There are 3 Japs moving. One's gone inside. I can't get a shot of him. And I know, don't shoot him. He'll give away your position." Napalm came down. It was one of the first uses of napalm. They didn't call it napalm. They called it gelatrol, but it was essentially the same thing. And nobody knew what it was. But they couldn't get the Japanese. They had to basically go in by hand and get them. There were night attacks under flares. But this photograph came about because they said, "Oh, on the end of the second morning, it was sodden and muddy, and I was just feeling like complete shit, and I hadn't slept, and I was trying to get a bit of shut eye next to this log, and I heard a voice almost next to my ear going, 'Hey mate, have you got time for a photo?' And he turned around, and it was a press photographer, probably that same press photographer that came ashore we saw in the other picture with the Matilda tank. And it was some press photographer from the Sydney Morning Herald getting a snapshot. And he took the shot, said, 'Thanks, mate,' and climbed back down the hill. And Lee's got a picture of it. That photo's the size of a matchbox, and I managed to get my publisher to reproduce it. But as with all the actions of the entire Borneo campaign, hardly anybody knows anything about them, and we'll get to that in a moment. All the Borneo campaigns went the same way. The Japanese compressed themselves into ever decreasing numbers, but the more they compressed themselves, the more their numbers became condensed. So they were actually more dangerous. They fought to the death almost everywhere. There were all sorts of strange adventures in North Borneo. The Japanese had where the oil infrastructure hadn't been damaged, they set fire to it. And so the Australians had to go in and act like firemen, and this went on to way after the end of the war. Some of the poor starving Malay civilians, just terrible what the Japanese did to them, starving them. And you can see the firefight that happened around this shed here. There's no more information about that. But there were rivers were involved. This sort of river campaign in North Borneo, where they sent a whole bunch of blokes up the river because the terrain was so muddy and impassable. They used river assaults, all sorts of strange adventures that I had no idea about, and they're all absolutely sort of more or less brilliantly executed. We used the Dayak people, the native people of North Borneo, to great effect. Z Special Forces flew in before the invasion, completely unannounced. This is one of these Z Special Forces bloke, was one of his Dayak warriors, and I would not like to meet that guy in a dark alley. Look, he's got bones or something decorating in his ear. These guys were magnificent natural soldiers. Not only were they fearless and bloodthirsty, they could handle weapons perfectly. They'd never touched before. They could handle modern weapons perfectly after about half an hour of instruction. They took orders. They could form up. They could march. They were brilliant, and they hated the Japanese. As the blokes said who were sort of organising them, they weren't sure what their reception was going to be because they hadn't been told they were arriving. And when they started to sound them out about whether they'd be willing to fight the Japanese, they just were so enthusiastic. And even better, they were told that they'd be allowed to resume their banished practice of headhunting again. That made them very happy, but as long as it was only on the Japanese. And they use things like blowpipes, poison blowpipes. It's an incredible story. Yeah, this is it's a very wet country, as you can imagine. and there was a lot of river activity and using local people to help Australian soldiers and commandos get from A to B and all sorts of things. There's uh, the campaign that the last campaign was Balikpapan. It again was very successful. It was the one that was still fighting at war's end. It ended quite suddenly, as we've discussed before, the Second World War with the atomic bombs. The Japanese were starting to crack and break down. The last few weeks, General Leslie Morshead was happy enough basically to say, look, they can't go anywhere. We have bottled them up. We're just going to, if they come out and attack, we'll attack back. But let's for now leave them where they are, because he sensibly said it really is about to happen. I love this photo. Okay. It on the invasion of Labuan, which was Obo 6, about an hour after the Australians established themselves on shore, a couple of blokes looked behind and saw these flashbulbs going along the beach and said, who the hell's that? And they said, my God, that's General MacArthur. MacArthur decided to just basically turn up an hour or so after the invasion, and he's with General Morshead there, the divisional commander, just for a basic photo op. And this guy, Lieutenant Colonel Jeans, who was the local battalion commander, was ordered to come back from where he was directing his soldiers in the fight to escort these two celebrities for a couple of hours and tell them what's going on. And he was furious at having to do so. He didn't care about Blamey and Morshead and MacArthur. And I think you can see it in his face. He just looks pissed off with his hands on his hips saying, what the hell am I doing here? I'm supposed to be fighting a war. Look, I want to get back to the front. And I've always loved that picture. But they stayed an hour or so and then went back. Diver Derek, what can you say? What a man, what a soldier, what a legend. And this is one of the sad things about the Borneo campaign. Look, not in the scheme of things, not many were killed. 2,000 casualties roughly, and about 5,500 deaths. And this fellow was one of them. Now, 500 deaths might not sound like a lot of people in the context of the Second World War, but I tell you what, it was about what we lost in Vietnam, and put 500 young men into a country hall, and it looks like a lot of people. And there was a lot of widows and a lot of lives ruined and a lot of fatherless children. So the awfulness of war, particularly a man like Tom Derrick. From South Australia, Tom Derrick had won the VC at Saddleburg. He was a magnificent natural leader, adored his men and adored by his men. I'll cut to the chase. He had a premonition that he wasn't coming back from this one. And a few days into the campaign, he was in one of these a night position along a ridge. He dug in, and he was just going around and seeing how his men were. He'd been promoted to an officer at this stage. There was a burst of machine gun from somewhere in the distance towards him, and stupidly, inexplicably, Derrick stood up to see where it had come from. Great trick by the Japanese. You fire at the same place, because you'll guess some idiot, and he wasn't an idiot, but he was an idiot in this case. The Japanese knew that, and they'd fire at the same position to catch someone trying to find where the fire was coming from. He was hit, mortally wounded, and died the next day. An absolute moaning of grief went through the Australian army, knowing that Derrick was dying. It's such a sad story. Even more remarkable, perhaps, is this fella, Les Starcevich. I think part of the Starcevich football clan from Western Australia, from Grass Patch, WA, near Kalgoorlie, from Serbian descent. Les Starcevich was on, he was at Tara, it's either Tarakan or Borneo. I'm sorry, I've actually forgotten. Balikpapan, I think. Okay, he was with a platoon. They were pinned down. They were trying to reach another platoon. They were pinned down by Japanese machine gunners and rifle and intense rifle fire. Each platoon was clumped into down on the ground into in patches of jungle and bush. and they couldn't reach each other. They couldn't go back. They couldn't go forward. They didn't know what to do. Les Starcevich stands up, borrows his mate's Bren gun, and starts walking down the path, emerges by himself into full view of the enemy, who start firing at them. Starcevich cocks his Bren gun, walks up to a Japanese machine gun nest of 3 people, kills them all, walks to another one, kills them all in that one, walks to another one, kills them in that one, and the other 2 flee. The people who witnessed it said they could not believe what they had just seen. Les then turned around, came back and said, "Okay, sir, I think we can go now." And said, "Les, what the hell did you just do?" Said, "Oh, I got sick of waiting there, sir, so I just thought I'd, you know." Okay, that would have won in the VC. A few hours later, he did it again, almost identically. All his friends said he was a very quiet boy, didn't say much, no concept of physical fear. He knew he wasn't going to be hit. He should have been pierced like a sieve, and not one bullet hit him. It's an incredible story. It defies reality, but there you go. There were a lot of witnesses to it. Les Starcevich, the last VC of the war, and it was Australian. I have not found another Victoria Cross awarded later than Les Starcevich in the last few weeks of the Second World War. I think he was the last VC of the war. The Borneo campaign, just one other thing I want to say, the forgotten campaign. When these blokes came home, they came home to a population that was sick to death of the war. Nobody wanted to know about it. I've been through the newspapers of the time in the Victorian State Library, of the Age and the Herald, and you try and find descriptions of the battles I've just been describing. And they're not even there. They're buried on page 6 and 7 after the kind of, recipes and stuff like that. Oh, war news. We're fighting in Borneo. And these people were dying. So it's quite incredible. They came back. A lot of the people said that we came back and nobody knew that we'd been there. We had to convince, oh, well, Borneo, we thought it was all over. No, we've actually been fighting. Then the horror of Sandakan started to emerge, and that had been happening in roughly the same area a little bit before the Borneo invasion got going. And of course, these guys in the army had no idea that was happening. And so that overshadowed what they did. So this campaign really has been the one that a lot of the veterans didn't talk about, because they almost felt um, they felt a bit like a lot of the Vietnam people. They'd been asked to do it and did a wonderful job, and they came back and the public basically didn't want to know about it. I opened the book with my one and only encounter with Bruce Ruxton, the former president of Victorian RSL, who I met doing, of all things, an ABC, Bruce and the ABC, yeah, not exactly happy bedfellows, but I was with him on a quiz team about military history, and he was, and at the end of it, I said, "Bruce, didn't you go to shore at Balikpapan?" And I swear to God, he turned and he said, "How did you know that?" And he sat. I said, "Oh, I just know you're in Borneo, and we don't talk about much the Borneo campaign." And he looked at me. He said, "Come over here, Sonny. We'll have a chat." He spoke to me for the next hour, and he became a completely different person. And he said, we came back, and I saw terrible things. He said, what the Japanese had done to our boys, to the civilians, to women. And we came back, and no one wanted to know. So it wasn't just the latter kind of long-haired generation that ignored these blokes. It was their own people that came back when they came back. And the war was done, and everybody was over it. But I wrote this book because it's an important battle. It was very good for the civilians of Borneo to be rid of the awful Japanese. The Australians conduct themselves very, very well, and it's a military campaign we can be enormously proud of, and that's the reason I wrote the book. And I've spoken too long, and I apologise. So thank you. I'm open now, but unless we're out of time.
No need to apologise, Michael. Thank you very much. It was a tremendous presentation.
Thank you.
There's no questions by chat at the moment. There's something I'll read out.
Thank you, David. Someone clap me.
But I'll invite some questions from the floor. Can I see people though? Can we change it so, Jason, so I can, well, how do we do this? That's better. Does anyone have questions of Michael?
Or a comment or an observation?
Graham.
Graham. Hi, Graham. We'll have to someone has to unmute Graham.
Graham can probably do that.
Graham has
There you
done
go,
it.
Graham.
How clever is Graham? Michael, thanks very much for that. I've probably got a comment more than a question, but I was
Sure.
interested in your comment about the different experiences in the AIF by the time they got to 1945 in Borneo. Um, my father was part of the 2nd 40th Battalion of Sparrow's Force on
Ah,
Timor.
wow.
And so he spent 12 months on occupied Timor before coming back to Australia. And then he was put with the 2nd 12th. And he was at the landing at Balikpapan.
Okay,
So,
okay.
so his experience would have been so totally different than the original 2nd 12th members and the reinforcements and so forth. You know, he'd
Indeed.
spent 12 months fighting a guerrilla warfare
Yeah.
on Timor. And I just picked that up as you made the comment about it. I was just very, very, very interested in that comment.
Oh yeah. Look, the war had changed by that stage, and the Australian Army had changed. The Australian Army had evolved too, but really, what your father was involved was essentially commando guerrilla war, which and he probably wouldn't have been properly trained for it either. What,
No,
what
no.
your what your dad and his colleagues did is unbelievable. The stories of how they got away with it on Timor is fantastic.
Yes, yep,
It's a
yep,
great story. Yeah, yeah.
yes, yep, yep,
There's a,
yep.
there's a question from Marcus Fielding. How much did the Dutch desire to reoccupy the Dutch East Indies
So
play in
now,
the decision
oh,
to proceed with the
oh,
campaign?
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Can you just read the entire question again, Brent?
How much did the Dutch desire to reoccupy the Dutch East Indies play in the decision to proceed with the campaign?
Oh, that's actually a very good and a very nuanced question. But the short answer is a lot. There was no concept back in 1945 of the Dutch and British colonies going to the actual indigenous inhabitants. Nobody even thought that. There is one weird plot that, and there is a chapter. There was an attempt, bizarrely, by an Australian intelligence unit called the Directorate, staffed by lawyers and anthropologists and odd people, one of which was a young John Kerr of yesterday's 50th anniversary fame. I kid you not. And it was a plot to uh, swipe North Borneo from the British to make it an Australian colony, an Australian protectorate. And the plan was to get the Australians in before the Japanese, after the Japanese have been kicked out in North Borneo, and before the Brits can come in, and it was kicked down the road, this idea that it'd become an Australian territory like New Guinea because we deserved it. But the other colonial, so colonialism had not even really entered its death throes. The Dutch absolutely made it clear that they would be going back into all their territories, no questions asked, as soon as was possible. And by God, they did. The story of the Dutch post-war is a really untold story. They were brutal. They were nasty. They were savage. They gave the Japanese a run for their money. Places like Bali, where we go on holidays, the Japanese retook Bali or tried to retake Bali savagely. The Balinese, of course, resisted, and there were fierce battles. But yes, the idea was for Australia to assist in the re-establishment of both British and Dutch colonial control, no questions asked. Even for a Labor government at the time under John Curtin, the notion that these places could be independent was decades away. That's a great question.
And there's a comment by David Gormley O'Brien. The Dutch government also claimed reparations from the Australian government for the destruction of oil processing plants at Balikpapan.
I did not know that. I did not know that. I hope we gave them nothing, but we probably did. Well, that's an amazing tidbit. Thank you for that. Oh, wow. That's a.
Brent, I was just going to interrupt. Maybe David Gormley O'Brien would like to explain gelatrol as he has in the
I was about to read.
or you can read it out.
I was about to read that out. So David Gormley O'Brien is a great contributor. Gelatrol, which is the napalm equivalent, was invented by the predecessor to the CSIRO and manufactured in Australia because the British counterpart was too intricate to use in the field. And Australia could not get access to Americans' napalm.
Yes, speak.
Wow. Oh, thank you. I told you guys know more about this than I do, so I'll learn far more from you than you can learn from me, I'm sure.
Well, pretty much everyone stayed, so I reckon you were contributing something.
Oh, thank you.
There's a question from David Hall as well. What is your next project? Or have you thought, as you previously mentioned, this is it in terms of the books?
I'm currently working on another book. If you can not quite.
Maybe I'll type it in there. Yeah.
Don't tell my current publisher. But so actually, they've got to find out some way. I actually don't care. I'm one of my other books, a non-military book, has been the story of the Ticonderoga, the hell ship, so-called sailing immigrant ship that came into Melbourne riddled with typhus during the gold rush, and the epic story of that involving my great-great-grandfather, who was the ship's doctor back in the day. Alan and Unwin have asked me to do another shipwreck story, so I'm doing the first book in 30 years that has been written on the saga of the Loch Ard, which is the very tragic but romantic story. People who know this southern Australian coast, the Victorian coast, the shipwreck coast, they might have visited Loch Ard Gorge. It's where the Loch Ard crashed, killing all but two people, a boy and a girl, and they were washed ashore, and everyone thought they were going to marry, but they didn't. But the story of that is something I'm working on at the moment, and it's an amazing story. So that's my next project. It's not a military one, but it should be out when I finish it. I'm already late.
So do we have any more questions?
Yeah, I'm being heard. Yes. Michael, excellent talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.
With Oboe, I seem to recall there were 5 or 6 of them.
6.
And you mentioned a couple of connections to it. One was an element of Oboe involved in the reconnaissance or the rescue of the people at Sandakan?
No. That never got off the ground. I've been reading about that. It was I think there was a lot of willful not quite being willing or able to grasp the facts of the extent of the Japanese incarceration of our people. Even though we had air superiority and probably could have been far more accurate in finding where these camps were, we didn't. You talk to the blokes who are with Weary, they didn't see a plane go over for 4 years. And they could have. We could have sent any number of aircraft over to take pictures of these camps. Could we have got to them? Probably not. When you think how practically could it have been done? If you send a commando unit to liberate one camp, the Japanese would have immediately ordered for the entire or every other camp to be liquidated. It's and then of course it ended up, there were, I believe, some nascent plans on paper to try and do something, try and find some of the camps that we knew of that you could land a ship near, but there weren't many. They were up in Thailand. They were sort of really the back of beyond. Often the Japanese didn't even know where they were. According to Weary's diary after the war that he annotated, he said that he met a couple of the Japanese after the war, which he did. Weary reached out to a couple of his former the baddies after the war, and they said, we didn't know, we got no idea. So sadly, I don't think that's a plan that ever seriously got off the ground. One of the great historical ifs, I think.
Oh, and on that other point, I understand under OBO there were SOE patrols into Malaysia or Malaya, and they were there really to rearm and encourage the locals to support the British Empire and vote the right way if they came to voting.
Yes, I believe that's true. The British were far more aware of anti-British feeling, and that they knew that there would be sort of uprisings, they called them, after the Japs had been kicked out to establish native control, and they were very, very keen to send their administrative units in to nip that in the bud, and but of course they didn't. But I mean, honestly, if they just let it all go early on after the war, they would have saved a lot of bloodshed all across the world.
One of the inferences, I think, even from the PM himself, was we want our colonies and we're less interested in looking for prisoner.
Yeah,
sort of a rough connection.
I have no doubt that what you say is completely true.
Thank you.
Guy Warnock asks the question, has the current Australian Army approached you to speak or otherwise engage with them about lessons learned from Operation OBOE series?
Not with this one, but I've spoken to the Australian Army quite a bit regarding my previous book about the Coast Watchers, particularly because we do have some operations, quiet operations in the Solomon Islands, and this is where a lot of the Coast Watchers were, and the Australians were very, very good at getting the local people on side. We're very, very good at actually, the Dayak people also like the Australians as well. I'm not just sort of blowing smoke up the bum of my own country. It's actually true. And a lot of the soldiers said, when they spoke to the native people, they said, we don't like the Dutch. We are ambivalent about the British. We're very fond of the Australians, but we hate the Japanese. But the Australians basically had because they weren't colonizers, they did, by all accounts, treat people with a lot more respect than particularly the Dutch did. The Dutch weren't particularly nice.
Jeff Trotter, you have a question that you wanted to ask?
No, just first up, I'd like to thank the group, thank Michael for putting this on, which is very informative.
Thanks, Jeff.
Also to mention that my uncle, my dad's brother, served in Borneo.
Okay.
And, on the 8th of August, he was a member of the B Company under the command of Lieutenant Backhouse, was patrolling a track west of Borrowang, and the message was passed by pigeon that hang on, the patrol had made contact with 9 Japanese soldiers and had killed 7, but ultimately Robert died of gunshot or
it would have been one of the last
wounds and stuff like that. So yeah,
it would have been one of the last. August 8th. Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah, and it was on the 12th, and he died on the 12th of August 45. So just prior to the end of the war, which he just a couple of days short. But thank you very much, Michael, for such a informative presentation.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you.
Yes, yeah.
It's so sad. Right at the end of the war.
Okay, yeah, it really was. It was just, yeah. And every year I march under the 2nd 14th battalion banner at the Melbourne Anzac Parade. So, and now I do have some copies of his medals, the Pacific Star and the General
you get the
Victory Medal. Yeah.
You get
the 45 Victory Medal. So
the 3945 Star and the Australia Defence Medal and the War Medal and the General Service Medal. I think he's entitled to.
The General Service Medal. So is he?
And he was also at Kokoda.
Kokoda track too.
Oh, so wow. Okay. Oh, he went through all that and on virtually the last day of the war. That's so sad.
Yeah, but very, very well presented, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Very good. Thanks. I'll open the floor to anyone else.
Are there any more questions, comments? No. Well, thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.
We've got a couple of other little bits of business to attend to. You're welcome to leave. You're welcome to stay.
Oh, thank you for all the claps. That's very nice. And the book is available. If you want me to, I'm sure you can. If you want me to, if you want a signed copy, just guys, just forward some emails on to me. If people want a signed copy, you guys have got my email, Jason. Just forward some emails to me.
info@mhv.org.au, and I'll make sure Michael gets it.
Yeah, and we can work out. I've got a couple of cases of the book at home. It's very easy to mail them out to you for Christmas and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's about $30, I think, for a copy, and I'm happy to sign one for you. Cool.
Thank you.
Okay. Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Very good. Thank you, Michael.
There you go.
Now, this is our upcoming conference in May. So put it in your diary. It's a 2-day conference on Vietnam at Waverley RSL. I haven't done anything about the speaker program for next year, but there'll be one in February. So information on that will be coming out shortly, I hope. And that's really about it. So that brings this evening's session to a close. Thanks to Michael, and thanks also to Jason, who keeps things going behind the scenes. And thank you for joining us. We hope you come again. And good night to you from the committee and myself, and we wish you a happy and safe holiday season.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good
Thank you,
session.
everyone.
Thanks,